The day he walked away, the church was brimming with light, and the air carried the faint scent of lilies and fresh roses. Every pew was filled with smiling faces, family members, and friends who had gathered to witness the union of two souls in love. Joanna Hamilton stood at the end of the aisle, dressed in an exquisite white gown that cascaded around her like a waterfall of silk. Her heart raced with a mix of joy and nerves. She had dreamed of this day since she was a little girl, imagining a future filled with love, laughter, and family. She glanced down the aisle and caught Walter Grayson's gaze. His sharp features, dark eyes, and confident smile had captivated her from the moment they met. He stood there in a tailored tuxedo, looking every bit the dashing groom, but something in his expression unsettled her. There was a hesitation, a fleeting shadow of doubt that seemed out of place in the midst of such a joyous occasion. Joanna shook off the unease, attributing it to pre-wedding jitters. The music swelled, and the officiant signaled for everyone to rise. Joanna took a deep breath and stepped forward, her father by her side. Each step brought her closer to Walter and the future she had dreamed of. But as she approached the altar, Walter's expression darkened. He looked away, his hands clenching and unclenching nervously. The officiant began the ceremony, his deep voice steadying Joanna's nerves. Yet, as the vows were about to be exchanged, Walter interrupted. "I can't do this," he said abruptly, his voice cracking. The room fell silent. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Walter stepped back, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. Joanna's heart sank. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Walter avoided her gaze. "I'm sorry, Joanna. I'm not ready for this. I can't be the man you deserve." The words felt like daggers, each one slicing through her dreams. Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached for him, but he pulled away. "I'm sorry," he repeated before turning and walking out of the church. Joanna stood frozen, her hands trembling as the weight of his actions crushed her. The whispers and murmurs from the guests grew louder, but all she could hear was the echo of Walter's footsteps fading into the distance. Her father gently guided her away from the altar, shielding her from the prying eyes of the crowd. Joanna felt numb, her mind spinning as she tried to process what had just happened. Walter, the man she had trusted with her heart, had left her standing at the altar without a second thought. That night, Joanna locked herself in her childhood bedroom. The beautiful white dress crumpled around her as she sobbed into her pillow. The pain was unbearable, a relentless ache that refused to let her breathe. She replayed the scene over and over in her mind, searching for answers, for a reason why Walter had abandoned her so cruelly. Days turned into weeks, and Joanna struggled to move forward. The small town buzzed with gossip, and every well-meaning glance or whispered comment only deepened her shame. She avoided the places she once loved, unable to face the pity in people's eyes. But amidst the darkness, a fire began to burn within her. Joanna realized she had two choices: let Walter's betrayal define her, or find the strength to rebuild her life. Slowly, she began to pick up the pieces, channeling her pain into her work as a landscape artist. Her hands became her solace, shaping beauty out of chaos, and her greenhouse became a sanctuary where she could heal away from the judgmental eyes of the world. Then came the letter. One rainy afternoon, as Joanna tended to her plants, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. It was from Walter's parents, who had always disapproved of her. Inside was a brief note and a check for an exorbitant sum of money. The note was curt, dismissive even, but the message was clear: leave the town and never speak of Walter again. Joanna stared at the check, her emotions boiling over. How dare they? Did they think she could be bought off? Her pain erased with the sum of money. She crumpled the check and threw it into the fire, watching as the flames consumed the paper and its insulting offer. She knew then that she couldn't stay in the town. The memories were too raw, the whispers too loud. With a heavy heart, Joanna packed her belongings and boarded a bus to the city. She left behind everything she had ever known, carrying only her determination to start anew. As the bus rumbled away from the town, Jonah gazed out the window, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what awaited her in the city, but she vowed to rise above the pain and forge a new path for herself. Walter had taken so much from her, but she refused to let him take her spirit. A new beginning in the shadows of the city. The bus pulled into the city station just before dawn. Jonah stepped off, clutching her small suitcase tightly, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. The city was a stark contrast to the quiet simplicity of her hometown. Towering buildings loomed above her, casting long shadows even in the early light. People moved with purpose, their faces set in expressions of focus and indifference. Jonah felt like a ghost among them, invisible and untethered. Her savings were meager, and she knew she had to make them stretch. The first few days were spent searching for a place to stay. She eventually found a tiny rundown apartment in an aging building that reeked of mildew and despair. The landlord, a gruff man with thick glasses, barely glanced at her as she handed over the deposit. "This isn't the Ritz," he said, tossing her the keys. Jonah forced a tight smile. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. The apartment was cold and dim, with peeling wallpaper and a persistent drip from the kitchen faucet. Still, it was hers, a place to start over. Jonah spent her days searching for work, her resume a sparse collection of odd jobs and her experience limited to the small-town greenhouse she had left behind. The city was ruthless, and rejection became a familiar refrain. She walked for miles each day, knocking on doors, filling out applications, and leaving her name at every place that would take it. By the end of the second week, her spirits were nearly as drained as her savings. She sat in a small diner nursing a cup of coffee she couldn't afford, staring out the window at the bustling streets. She had never felt more alone. That was when she met Deborah Harris. Deborah swept into the diner like a gust of wind, her sharp eyes scanning the room before landing on Jonah. She was a middle-aged woman with an air of confidence, her hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun. She wore a tailored coat that spoke of success, but her expression carried a warmth that set her apart from the hardened city crowd. "You look like you could use a real meal," Deborah said, sliding into the seat across from Jonah. Jonah blinked, startled by the sudden intrusion. "Excuse me." Deborah gestured to the barely touched coffee. "That won't keep you going. Let me buy you something." I'm fine," Jonah stammered, embarrassed by the pity in Deborah's eyes. "Fine." Deborah raised an eyebrow. "Honey, you're sitting here looking like the weight of the world just dropped on your shoulders. Let me guess, you're new to the city, out of work, and wondering if you made a huge mistake coming here." Jonah's lips parted in surprise. "How did you?" Deborah chuckled. "I've been around long enough to recognize the look. Let me help you." Though hesitant, Jonah found herself opening up to Deborah, sharing bits of her story between bites of the sandwich Deborah insisted she order. She didn't mention Walter or the heartbreak that had driven her here, but she spoke of the struggle to find her footing in the city. Deborah listened intently, nodding at the right moments. When Jonah finished, Deborah leaned back in her seat, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You remind me of myself," Deborah said. "I came to this city with nothing but a dream and a stubborn streak. It wasn't easy, but I found my way. You will too." Jonah felt a flicker of hope. "How?" Deborah smiled. "For starters, I got a friend who's looking for some help. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work." "Interested?" Jonah nodded eagerly. "Yes, absolutely." Deborah's friend turned out to be Charles Evans, a wealthy businessman who lived in a sprawling estate on the edge of the city. The position was for a housemaid, a far cry from Jonah's dreams of building a career in horticulture, but it was a lifeline she couldn't refuse. When she arrived at the Evans estate, Jonah was struck by its grandeur. The towering gates and manicured lawns were a world away from her cramped apartment. Charles himself was a reserved man in his late 30s, with a quiet intensity that bordered on intimidating. He introduced himself briskly, explaining her duties with the efficiency of someone who valued time above all else. "You'll start tomorrow," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jonah nodded, grateful for the opportunity but wary of the coldness in his demeanor. The first weeks at the estate were grueling. Jonah scrubbed floors, polished silver, and attended to the endless demands of Mara Evans, Charles's wife. Mara was a striking woman with an icy presence, her beauty marred by a perpetual air of dissatisfaction. She treated Jonah with disdain, barely acknowledging her existence unless it was to issue a command. Jonah kept her head down, pouring herself into her work. She found solace in the quiet moments when she could tend to the plants in the estate's garden, her fingers itching to bring life to the neglected flower beds. It wasn't long before Jonah noticed the cracks in the Evans household. Charles and Mara barely spoke, their interactions strained and perfunctory. Mara's disinterest in the impending birth of her children, the triplets she had conceived through surrogacy, was palpable. The surrogate, Clara, was a timid young woman who moved through the house like a shadow. Jonah often saw her sitting alone in the garden, her hands resting protectively on her growing belly. Clara's haunted eyes and hesitant demeanor tugged at Jonah's heart. One afternoon, Jonah approached Clara, offering her a cup of tea. "You look like you could use a friend," Jonah said gently. Clara hesitated before accepting the cup. "Thank you," she murmured. As the days passed, the two women formed a tentative bond. Clara confided in Jonah, sharing her fears about Mara's coldness and her own uncertainty about her place in the Evans family. Jonah listened, offering what comfort she could. But the fragile peace of the estate was shattered when Clara disappeared without warning, just weeks before the triplets were due. Her absence sent shockwaves through the household. Mara's indifference turned to barely concealed panic, while Charles retreated further into his work. Jonah found herself drawn into the chaos, her role shifting from housemaid to caretaker as the triplets arrived prematurely. The tiny, fragile babies were abandoned by Mara, who refused to so much as hold them. Jonah, still grieving the loss of her own child, stepped into the void, nursing and caring for them as if they were her own. Each sleepless night spent cradling the triplets deepened her connection to them. They became her anchor, giving her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. But as Jonah grew closer to the children, the secrets of the Evans family began to unravel. Whispers of betrayal, manipulation, and hidden agendas reached her ears, pulling her into a web of lies that threatened to destroy everything she had rebuilt. Secrets beneath the surface. The Evans estate was eerily quiet in the wake of Clara's sudden disappearance. The triplets, still tiny and fragile, demanded constant attention, and Jonah willingly took on the responsibility. Nights blurred into days as she fed, bathed, and soothed the infants. In those moments, she felt a deep sense of purpose, but the nagging questions about Clara's fate lingered in the back of her mind. Mara's behavior had grown increasingly erratic. Her usual icy composure gave way to sharp, cutting remarks and bursts of anger. She seemed to avoid the nursery altogether, leaving the care of her children entirely to Jonah. Charles, meanwhile, spent long hours locked in his study, his focus split between managing his business empire and dealing with the fallout of Clara's absence. One evening, Jonah ventured into the study, hesitant but determined. She needed answers about Clara and the strange tension that seemed to hang over the household like a dark cloud. Charles looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression weary but curious. "Is something wrong?" he asked, gesturing for her to sit. Jonah hesitated before speaking. "It's about Clara. I can't stop thinking about her. She didn't seem like someone who would just leave without a word." Charles leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You're not the only one who thinks that," he admitted. "Clara was scared before she left. I didn't realize how much until it was too late." "Scared of what?" Jonah pressed. He hesitated, then sighed. "Mara." Jonah's breath caught. "Mara." Charles nodded, his expression grim. Their relationship was complicated. Mara was controlling, always trying to keep Clara in line. I didn't see how bad it had gotten until Clara was gone. Jonah's mind raced. She thought of Clara's nervous glances, her quiet demeanor, and the way her hands often trembled. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was chilling. "Do you think she left because of Mara?" Jonah asked. Charles shook his head. "I don't think she left voluntarily at all." The weight of his words settled heavily on Jonah. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a shiver down her spine. Over the next few days, Jonah began to notice things she hadn't before. The staff seemed uneasy, their conversations hushed whenever she entered the room. Mara's movements were sharp and deliberate, her eyes darting around as if she were constantly on edge. And then there were the late-night phone calls, muffled voices leaking through the thin walls of the estate. One night, unable to sleep, Jonah crept down the hall and stood outside Mara's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear Mara speaking in low, urgent tones. "I don't care how you do it," Mara hissed. "Just find her. We can't afford loose ends." Jonah's stomach turned. Who was Mara trying to find? Was it Clara? She backed away from the door, her heart pounding. She knew she was venturing into dangerous territory, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was deeply wrong. A chance discovery. Jonah's suspicions deepened when she stumbled upon a locked drawer in Mara's desk while cleaning. Normally, she would have respected the privacy of her employers, but something compelled her to act. She searched the room for a key and eventually found one tucked beneath a stack of papers. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the drawer. Inside, she found a collection of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be a journal. She flipped through the pages, her heart sinking as she read Mara's cold, calculating entries. The journal detailed Mara's growing resentment toward Clara, whom she referred to as the interloper. Mara's entries revealed her attempts to manipulate and control Clara, using veiled threats and emotional manipulation to keep her in line. But it was a single photograph that stopped Jonah cold. It was a picture of Clara standing next to a woman Jonah didn't recognize. The woman's features were strikingly similar to Jonah's own, and her heart skipped a beat. Who was this woman? And why did she look so familiar? Jonah tucked the photograph into her pocket, her mind racing. She needed answers, and she knew there was only one person who could provide them: her grandmother, Sonia. Unraveling the past. The following weekend, Jonah made the trip to her grandmother's home. Sonia was surprised to see her, but her expression quickly turned guarded when Jonah pulled out the photograph. "Who is this?" Jonah demanded, holding up the picture. Sonia's face paled, and she sank into her armchair. "Where did you get that?" "From Mara's office," Jonah replied. "Grandma, please, I need to know the truth." Sonia sighed heavily, her hands trembling as she reached for the photograph. "That woman is Margaret Harper. She's your mother." Jonah's breath caught. "What? No, that's not possible. You told me my mother died when I was a baby." "I lied," Sonia admitted, her voice breaking. Margaret was troubled. "She made a lot of mistakes, and I thought it was better if you didn't know. She abandoned you, Jonah. I raised you because I didn't want you to grow up thinking you weren't wanted." Jonah sank into the couch, her mind reeling. "And Clara?" Sonia hesitated. "She's your half-sister. Margaret had her years after she left you with me. I didn't know what became of her until now." Jonah's chest tightened. Clara wasn't just a surrogate carrying the Evans children. She was family. The burden of truth. Armed with this new information, Jonah returned to the estate. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, but also a growing sense of dread. Mara's hostility toward Clara suddenly made sense. Clara wasn't just a surrogate. She was a threat to Mara's control over the Evans family. Jonah confided in Charles, showing him the photograph and sharing what Sonia had told her. Charles was stunned but quickly understood the implications. "Mara knew," he said. "She must have. That's why she's been so desperate to get rid of Clara." The two of them began working together to uncover more about Mara's dealings. Charles hired a private investigator to track down Clara, while Jonah focused on caring for the triplets and gathering as much information as she could from the staff. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. Joanna began to feel like she was being watched, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Mara was always one step ahead. But Joanna was no longer the same woman who had been left at the altar. She had found strength in her pain, and she was determined to protect her family, no matter what it took. Shadows of deception. The air inside the Evans estate grew heavier with every passing day, the tension so thick that it seemed to seep into the very walls. Joanna couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the window sent her heart racing. Mara's absence from the nursery had grown more conspicuous, but her shadow loomed larger than ever, as if she were orchestrating chaos from afar. Charles's private investigator had sent word that he was closing in on Clara. The news gave Joanna a flicker of hope, but it was quickly tempered by the growing unease that Mara's influence was far from diminished. Joanna knew Mara wasn't the kind of woman to accept defeat quietly. She was plotting, and they needed to be ready. One evening, as Joanna sat in the nursery cradling the smallest of the triplets, she heard faint voices outside the window. The sound was muffled, but the urgency in the tone was unmistakable. She peered through the curtains, her breath catching when she saw a figure lurking near the garden gate. Before she could get a better look, the figure slipped into the shadows, disappearing as if they'd never been there. She hurried to Charles's study to tell him what she'd seen. He was hunched over his desk, a stack of papers and his laptop illuminated by the soft glow of the desk lamp. "Charles," she said, her voice trembling. "There was someone near the garden gate. I think they were watching the house." Charles looked up sharply, his expression hardening. "Did you see who it was?" Joanna shook her head. "No, they were gone before I could make out their face." Charles stood, his jaw set. "I'll alert the security team. We can't afford to take any chances, a discovery that changes everything." The following day, Joanna decided to take matters into her own hands. She had spent enough time reacting to Mara's schemes. It was time to go on the offensive. Her instincts told her that the key to unraveling Mara's plans lay in Clara's disappearance and the mysterious connection to their shared mother, Margaret Harper. She returned to Mara's office, determined to find more clues. Her heart pounded as she searched through drawers, shelves, and filing cabinets. At first, it seemed like a fruitless endeavor, just stacks of financial records and correspondence. But then she found a small locked box tucked away in the back of a drawer. Joanna rummaged through the desk until she found the key. Her hands shook as she opened the box, revealing a collection of items that sent a chill down her spine. Photographs of Clara, including one of her visibly pregnant and standing outside the estate, a crumpled piece of paper with a phone number scrawled on it, and a folder labeled Margaret. Inside the folder were documents that painted a grim picture of their mother's past. There were arrest records, eviction notices, and medical reports indicating a history of addiction. But what stood out most was a letter addressed to Mara from Margaret. Joanna's blood ran cold as she read it. In the letter, Margaret begged Mara for forgiveness, pleading for a chance to see Clara. She wrote of her regrets, her mistakes, and her hope that Clara could grow up in a loving home, something Margaret admitted she could never provide. The date on the letter was years old, but it was clear that Mara had kept it, a silent reminder of her power over both Margaret and Clara. Joanna's hands tightened around the paper. Mara hadn't just manipulated Clara. She had manipulated their entire family, keeping secrets that could have reunited them, but instead using them as leverage. Clara's return. The investigator finally tracked Clara down in a small coastal town several hours away. Joanna and Charles immediately made plans to bring her back to the estate. Clara was hesitant at first, her fear palpable, but Joanna's persistence and assurances of protection finally convinced her. When Clara arrived, the reunion was bittersweet. She looked thin and exhausted, her eyes darting nervously around the estate, as if expecting Mara to appear at any moment. But when she saw the triplets, her expression softened, and tears welled in her eyes. "They look so much like her," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Like Margaret." Jonah reached for Clara's hand, squeezing it tightly. "You're safe here," she said firmly. "We'll protect you." Clara nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. The final play. Clara's return was a turning point. She brought with her not only the truth about Mara's manipulations, but also a key piece of evidence that could bring Mara down for good. Before she fled, Clara had managed to record a conversation between herself and Mara. A damning exchange in which Mara admitted to orchestrating the surrogacy arrangement, not out of maternal desire, but as a way to secure her position in the Evans family and keep Charles under her control. Jonah and Charles knew they had to act quickly. With Clara's testimony and the recording, they could take Mara to court, exposing her schemes and severing her hold on the family. But Mara was not to be underestimated. She had allies in the shadows, people who owed her favors and were willing to do her bidding. One night, while Jonah and Clara were in the nursery, the power in the estate suddenly went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and an eerie silence descended. Jonah's heart raced as she heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. "Stay here," she whispered to Clara, her voice shaking. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the hallway, the beam cutting through the darkness. As she moved through the house, she heard a crash from the study. She hurried toward the sound, her flashlight trembling in her hand. When she reached the door, she found it ajar. Inside, Charles was standing over a man Jonah didn't recognize, his fist clenched and his expression fierce. "He was trying to get to the files," Charles said, his voice low and dangerous. The man on the floor groaned, clutching his side. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he spat. "Mara won't stop. She'll burn this place to the ground before she lets you win." Jonah's blood ran cold. Mara's reach was greater than they had imagined. A united front. The next morning, Jonah, Charles, and Clara met in the study to finalize their plan. They knew they had to act fast. With the evidence they had gathered, they could not only protect the triplets, but also ensure that Mara would face the consequences of her actions. "We need to release the recording," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "It's the only way to stop her." Charles nodded. "I've already contacted the legal team. Once this goes public, Mara won't have any leverage left." Jonah placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "You're brave," she said softly. "We wouldn't have made it this far without you." Clara smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with tears. "We're in this together." As they prepared for the battle ahead, Jonah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had started this journey broken and uncertain, but now she stood tall, surrounded by the family she had fought to protect. Mara's games were coming to an end, and Jonah was ready to face whatever came next. Mara's last gambit. The morning sunlight spilled across the Evans estate, but its golden glow did little to dispel the tension that hung in the air. The quiet was deceptive, a fragile calm before the inevitable storm. Jonah stood in the nursery, cradling one of the triplets as the other two dozed peacefully. Her mind was racing, replaying the events of the past few days. Clara's return had given them the momentum they needed, but with Mara's influence and reach, they knew they couldn't let their guard down. The stakes had never been higher. Mara had everything to lose, and people like her didn't retreat without a fight. In the study, Charles was on a conference call with his legal team, his voice clipped and authoritative. Jonah could hear snippets of the conversation as she passed by the door. The recording Clara had brought back, a damning confession of Mara's manipulation and schemes, was their trump card, but using it would come with risks. If Mara caught wind of their plan before it was executed, she could strike back in ways they couldn't anticipate. Clara entered the nursery quietly, her footsteps soft. She looked better than when she first arrived, less haunted, though the fear hadn't completely left her eyes. "I still can't believe we're doing this," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonah looked at her sister, feeling a mix of admiration and concern. "We have to. It's the only way to stop her." Clara nodded, her gaze falling on the sleeping babies. "She's not just going to give up, Jonah. You know that, right? Mara doesn't lose. She destroys. Jonah's grip tightened on the baby in her arms. Then we make sure she has nothing left to destroy. The trap tightens. Later that afternoon, Jonah, Charles, and Clara gathered in the estate's parlor, where Charles laid out the final steps of their plan. The recording would be sent to a trusted journalist with instructions to release it publicly alongside a detailed exposé of Mara's actions. Charles had also arranged for an emergency custody hearing, armed with affidavits from Clara, the private investigator, and even some of Mara's former allies who had turned against her. It's not just about protecting the children, Charles said, his tone resolute. This is about making sure Mara can't hurt anyone else ever again. Clara's voice was steady as she added, "We need to act fast. She'll sense something is coming." Jonah nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. "What about Gregory? He's still out there." Charles's expression darkened. "I've taken care of Gregory. He won't be a problem." Jonah wanted to press him further, but the look in his eyes told her it was best not to ask. There were some battles Charles needed to fight on his own. The night of the break-in. That night, Jonah found it impossible to sleep. She sat in the nursery, watching over the triplets as they slept. The soft glow of the nightlight bathed the room in a warm hue, but it did little to ease her unease. She felt the weight of their plan pressing down on her, the knowledge that everything could fall apart if even one thing went wrong. Around midnight, she heard a faint noise outside. Her heart leaped into her throat as she strained to listen. It came again, a rustling, followed by the soft crunch of gravel. Jonah stood, her body tense, and moved to the window. In the dim light of the moon, she saw a figure moving near the edge of the garden. She hurried to Charles's study, where he and a security guard were reviewing the estate's surveillance footage. "There's someone outside," she said breathlessly. Charles immediately sprang into action, instructing the guard to alert the rest of the security team. "Stay here," he told Jonah, but she shook her head. "I'm not hiding while this is happening," she said firmly. Charles hesitated, then nodded. Together, they made their way toward the garden, where the security team was already combing the area. The figure Joanna had seen was nowhere to be found, but they discovered fresh footprints leading toward the east side of the property. A security camera had been disabled, its wires cleanly cut. Charles's jaw tightened. This wasn't random. Someone was scouting the property. Jonah felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think it was Mara?" "It's possible," Charles said, "but it could also be someone working for her." As they returned to the house, Charles placed a hand on Jonah's shoulder. "We're running out of time. We need to execute the plan tomorrow." The courtroom battle. The following morning, Jonah dressed carefully, choosing a simple yet elegant outfit that projected confidence. Clara did the same, though her hands trembled as she buttoned her blouse. "I don't know if I can do this," she said, her voice shaky. Jonah took her sister's hands in hers. "You can. You've been through worse, and you've survived. This is just one more fight." The courtroom was a stark, intimidating place, its high ceilings and polished wood adding to the gravity of the moment. Mara was already there when they arrived, sitting with her lawyer at the plaintiff's table. She looked as composed as ever, but there was an edge to her that hadn't been there before, a tightness around her eyes, a stiffness in her posture. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The proceedings began, with Mara's lawyer making the first move, arguing that Mara was the rightful custodian of the children, and that Clara's testimony was unreliable. But then Charles's lawyer played the recording. The courtroom was filled with Mara's voice, cold and calculating, as she admitted to manipulating Clara and using the children as pawns in her scheme to maintain control over the Evans empire. Gasps rippled through the room, and Mara's composure finally cracked. She leaped to her feet, her face contorted with rage. "This is a setup," she shouted. "You can't prove anything." The judge banged his gavel, demanding order, but the damage was done. Clara's testimony, combined with the recording and the investigator's findings, painted a damning picture of Mara's actions. By the end of the hearing, it was clear that Mara had no ground to stand on. Mara's downfall. As the judge ruled in favor of Charles and Clara, awarding full custody of the triplets to Charles and issuing a restraining order against Mara, Joanna felt a wave of relief wash over her. Mara's reign of terror was finally over. But the victory was bittersweet. As they left the courtroom, Joanna couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Mara might have been defeated legally, but someone like her didn't simply disappear. She was a wounded animal now, dangerous and unpredictable. "Do you think it's really over?" Clara asked as they climbed into the car. Joanna hesitated before answering. "For now. But we'll need to stay vigilant." As the car pulled away from the courthouse, Joanna looked out the window at the city streets. She had started this journey as a woman broken by betrayal, but now she was stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her family. And she wasn't going to lose. The price of freedom. The Evans estate felt like a different place in the days following the court's decision. For the first time in months, the oppressive tension had lifted, replaced by a tentative sense of calm. The triplets cooed and giggled in the nursery, oblivious to the chaos that had surrounded their young lives. Joanna watched over them with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. These children had become her anchor, her reason to fight. And now, they were safe. But even as the dust settled, Joanna couldn't shake the feeling that Mara wasn't finished. The courtroom defeat might have been a devastating blow to Mara's ego, but it wasn't in her nature to simply walk away. Someone like Mara didn't accept loss. She plotted revenge. Charles seemed to share her unease. He spent hours each day meeting with security consultants, tightening the estate's defenses, and monitoring financial accounts to ensure Mara couldn't exploit any hidden vulnerabilities. Clara, on the other hand, focused on healing. Though still cautious, she was starting to find her footing, her bond with Joanna deepening as they navigated the complexities of their newfound sisterhood. An unlikely alliance. Late one evening, as Joanna prepared for bed, a knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Daniel Carter standing there, his face shadowed and unreadable. Joanna hadn't seen him since the custody hearing, and his sudden appearance filled her with both curiosity and apprehension. "Daniel," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "What are you doing here?" "I thought you'd want to know," he said, his voice low. "Mara's been making moves. She's reached out to some dangerous people." Joanna's stomach dropped. "How do you know that?" Daniel hesitated, then sighed. "I've been keeping tabs on her. After everything that happened, I couldn't just walk away. She's desperate, Joanna. She's trying to regain control, and she's willing to burn everything down to get it." Joanna frowned, her mind racing. "Why are you telling me this? What's in it for you?" Daniel met her gaze, his expression earnest. "Because I owe you. I stood by and watched you suffer for years, and I didn't do anything to help. This is my chance to make it right." Joanna studied him for a moment, then nodded. "If you're serious about helping, we need to act fast." The final confrontation. With Daniel's information, Joanna and Charles began piecing together Mara's next move. It became clear that she had enlisted the help of a shadowy figure named Vincent Grady, a known fixer with a reputation for taking on dirty jobs. Vincent was ruthless, and his involvement meant Mara wasn't just plotting revenge. She was planning something far more dangerous. Joanna and Charles decided to set a trap. Using Daniel's connections, they planted false information about a supposed safe house where Clara and the triplets were staying. The hope was that Mara and Vincent would take the bait, revealing their location and giving law enforcement the evidence needed to finally put an end to their schemes. The plan was risky, and Joanna knew it. What if it goes wrong? She asked Charles as they finalized the details. "It won't," he said, his voice firm. "We've covered every angle." But Joanna couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her gut. Mara had proven time and again that she was unpredictable and cunning. There was no telling what she might do when cornered. The night of the sting. The trap was set at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Charles's security team, along with a handful of undercover officers, were stationed inside, waiting for Mara and Vincent to arrive. Joanna insisted on being there, despite Charles's protests. "I'm not sitting this one out," she said. "This is my fight too." Charles reluctantly agreed, and Joanna joined him in a concealed observation room overlooking the warehouse floor. Clara stayed behind at the estate with the triplets, her safety prioritized above all else. Hours passed as they waited in tense silence. Then, just after midnight, a sleek black car pulled up outside the warehouse. Joanna's heart raced as she watched Mara step out, followed closely by a tall, broad-shouldered man she assumed was Vincent. They moved with purpose, their expressions cold and calculating. Inside the warehouse, the undercover officers stayed hidden, their hands on their weapons. Joanna held her breath as Mara and Vincent approached the center of the room, where a decoy briefcase had been placed. It was filled with forged documents meant to lure them into believing they'd uncovered valuable information. "They're taking the bait," Charles whispered. As Mara opened the briefcase, the officers sprang into action, surrounding her and Vincent with weapons drawn. Mara's face twisted in fury, but Vincent remained eerily calm. "You think this is over?" Mara spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won?" Charles stepped out of the shadows, his expression cold. "It's over, Mara. There's nowhere left to run." But Vincent wasn't as resigned. In a blur of motion, he reached for a concealed weapon, forcing the officers to act. Chaos erupted as shots rang out, the sound echoing through the warehouse. Joanna clutched Charles's arm, her heart pounding as the scene unfolded below. When the dust settled, Vincent lay unconscious on the ground, restrained by the officers. Mara was handcuffed and dragged away, her screams of protest fading as she was escorted to a waiting police car. A new chapter. In the days following Mara's arrest, the atmosphere at the Evans estate shifted once again. The threat that had loomed over them for so long was finally gone, and a sense of peace began to take root. The triplets thrived under Joanna's care, their laughter filling the once quiet halls. Clara, too, began to heal. She and Joanna spent hours talking, sharing stories about their pasts and imagining the future they could build together. The bond they had forged through adversity grew stronger with each passing day. As for Joanna and Charles, their partnership deepened into something more. The respect and trust they had built through their shared struggles blossomed into a quiet, unspoken affection. They didn't rush anything, choosing instead to let their connection develop naturally. One evening, as they sat together on the veranda watching the sunset, Charles turned to Joanna. "You've changed this place," he said softly. "You've changed me." Joanna smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "And you've shown me that it's possible to rebuild, even after everything falls apart." Legacy of strength. Joanna's journey had been one of heartbreak and resilience, loss and redemption. She had arrived at the Evans estate as a broken woman searching for purpose, and now she stood as a pillar of strength for the family she had fought to protect. Mara's influence was gone, but her actions had left a lasting mark, a reminder of the power of deception and greed. Joanna chose to focus not on the scars, but on the future she was building, one filled with love, family, and hope. As she walked through the estate, the triplets toddling alongside her, Joanna felt a deep sense of peace. She had been tested in ways she never imagined, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. This was her new beginning, healing and new beginnings. The Evans estate stood quiet in the days following Mara's arrest, but it was not the eerie silence of tension. It was the quiet of healing. The once oppressive shadows that had lingered in the halls seemed to dissipate with Mara's departure, replaced by a renewed sense of safety and possibility. Joanna found herself at the heart of this transformation. The triplets thrived under her care, their giggles echoing through the estate as they toddled around the gardens. Clara spent more time with them, growing more comfortable as a sister and an aunt. Slowly, the deep wounds Mara had inflicted began to close. Clara's redemption. One afternoon, Clara and Joanna sat on a bench in the garden, watching the children play. The winter sunlight cast a golden glow over the scene, and for the first time in what felt like years, Clara smiled. A genuine, unburdened smile. "You know," Clara began, her voice soft, "I never thought I'd feel safe again. I spent so long running, looking over my shoulder. But here, with you and the kids, I feel like I can finally breathe." Joanna reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve this, Clara. You've been through so much, but you're still here. You're stronger than you think." Clara nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "And so are you. I wouldn't have made it without you." The bond between the two sisters had become unbreakable, forged in the fires of shared pain and triumph. Joanna knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Charles's proposal. As the days turned into weeks, the relationship between Joanna and Charles continued to evolve. What had started as a professional alliance and a shared determination to protect the triplets had grown into something deeper. Charles, once guarded and distant, now sought Joanna's presence at every opportunity. Joanna, too, found herself drawn to his quiet strength and unwavering commitment to his family. One evening, Charles invited Joanna to dinner. It was a simple affair, just the two of them in the cozy dining room, the table adorned with candles and fresh flowers from the garden. As they ate, Charles seemed uncharacteristically nervous, his usual calm demeanor giving way to hesitation. "Joanna," he said finally, setting down his fork, "I've been thinking a lot about everything we've been through. About what you've done for me, for the children, for this family." Joanna smiled softly. "It's nothing you wouldn't have done for me." He shook his head. "It's more than that. You've given me hope when I thought there was none. You've shown me what it means to truly care for someone, to put others before yourself. And I don't want to imagine this life without you." Joanna's heart fluttered as Charles reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a simple yet elegant ring, its single diamond catching the light. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Not as a replacement for what we've lost, but as a new beginning. A partnership built on trust, love, and everything we fought for." Joanna's breath caught, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, Charles, I'll marry you." Charles slipped the ring onto her finger, and for the first time in years, Joanna felt a profound sense of belonging. She had found her place, not just as a caretaker or a sister, but as a partner and a mother to the family she had fought so hard to protect. A future worth fighting for. The wedding was a small, intimate affair held in the garden of the estate. Clara stood by Joanna's side as her maid of honor, while the triplets, now walking and babbling, served as the most adorable attendants. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful, a celebration of resilience, love, and the family they had created together. As Joanna and Charles exchanged vows, surrounded by the people who mattered most, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The journey that had brought her here had been filled with heartbreak, betrayal, and hardship, but it had also given her strength, purpose, and love. The legacy of strength. In the months that followed, life at the Evans estate blossomed. Joanna and Charles worked together to create a home filled with warmth and love, a place where the triplets could grow up free from the shadows of the past. Clara continued to heal, finding joy in her role as an aunt and reconnecting with parts of herself she had long buried. Joanna also began a new project, transforming the estate's neglected garden into a lush sanctuary filled with flowers, vegetables, and fruit trees. It became a place of renewal and growth, a symbol of the life they had built together. But Joanna's greatest triumph wasn't the garden or the estate. It was the family she had fought to protect. She had taken the broken pieces of her life and forged them into something beautiful, something lasting. She had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and danger, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. As she stood in the garden one evening, watching the triplets chase fireflies under the fading light of the sunset, Joanna felt a profound sense of peace. The past had tried to break her, but it had only made her stronger, and now she was exactly where she was meant to be. The Evans estate, once a house filled with secrets and sorrow, had become a home filled with love, laughter, and hope for the future. And Joanna, the woman who had been left at the altar, had found her happily ever after in the most unexpected of places.